If you were a composer tasked with writing the music for a cyberpunk series complete with incredibly advanced technology in a sci-fi world, chances are your first thought would be to write electronic music to fit the setting. This is pretty much the standard, just as most fantasy shows rely mostly on acoustic and orchestral music since electronics wouldn't mesh as well with our expectations or what's being depicted on screen. That isn't to say that you'll never find series that subvert this trope, but those that do it aren't exactly common, and those that do it with clear intention are even fewer in number. And for that reason,菅野祐悟work on Psycho Pass is one of the most interesting soundtracks to delve into, and is the reason he's become one of my absolute favorite composers. Now, you might not recognize the name菅野祐悟, but if you've been on the internet or even just been aware of anime-related memes for the past few years, you're definitely familiar with his music. Why? Because he's responsible for this. Yes, despite having written all the music for JoJo since Stardust Crusaders onwards, he's not a name most anime fans are familiar with, which I think is a huge shame given how incredible his overall work tends to be. I mean, if JoJo itself wasn't enough to convince you, Psycho Pass and Cells at Work Black should be, and that's just to name a few of his works that I can think of off the top of my head. But back to the main topic, Psycho Pass was the first show I heard Kanno's music in, and while he doesn't have a huge library of anime series he's worked on, he's someone I can always count on for a great soundtrack because of how much thought goes into his process. The world of Psycho Pass is highly futuristic, and most of the music in the series is electronic or a hybrid of electronics and acoustics, as we can hear in the current example. This is the main theme of the series, and suitably has some rapid synths pulsing away throughout the entire piece while an electric guitar comes in and out of the forefront. Quite noticeably, however, is the use of piano, strings, and tin whistle throughout the piece. These calmer, acoustically driven sections give us the sense that there is much more to the story than rapid-fire cyberpunk action, relaying the more thoughtful sections that have the detectives investigating their cases while also questioning the system they work within. While it may be obvious to point out, these acoustic instruments are more indicative of the human elements of the show, giving the audience a much more grounded, humanistic sound than what is conveyed by the electronic instruments. To get a sense of how this is portrayed, let's have a listen to one of the tracks that focuses much more on the electronic side and how it deviates from the sense of humanity. Aside from some string textures and the percussive anvil strike, there really isn't anything about this track that sounds acoustic or, well, human. That isn't to say it sounds bad at all, rather the electronic effects and layers are utilized well to fit with the idea behind the track, that being about obsession. While I can't recall if this is specifically tied to one of the latent criminals in the series or if it's just a general piece of darker music, it could quite easily fit into either situation, given that the minds of the criminals in the show has deviated so far from humanity that only these inhuman sounds can really convey what we're experiencing through their eyes. This track in particular is quite heavy on the low, rumbly bass synth, giving us a rising, non-specific pitch that, at least for me personally, kind of makes me think of mud or sludge of some sort, bubbling up in a slow, viscous manner. That visualization has very little to do with anything that occurs in the series, but it's also not anything close to a sane human being. Your own interpretation or synesthesia might differ from mine, but I'd be surprised if the sounds in this piece made anyone think of a human being. And the idea of obsession is nicely, if not subtly, explored throughout the piece, repeating this sludgy bass sound over and over while also keeping the actual harmonic bass line mostly on one note. This keeps the harmony somewhat constant for the entire track's runtime, changing only slightly towards the end before reverting back, not unlike how an obsession would keep the obsessor continuously coming back for more no matter the changes. The only human element, the strings, are played in a pad-like style, acting more as an additional texture to add a bit of melodic emotion and tension. In this way, we might conclude that while the music itself has human elements to it, this is merely a fabrication, a soulless husk that only seems slightly human on the surface. And given what kinds of people the majority of criminals and psychopaths are, I think it's fair to say that this is exactly the kind of music suited to them. Here we have something much more acoustic, but with a fair amount of electronic elements, particularly in the percussion. Dominators are specialized guns wielded by the inspectors and enforcers that, through the use of the Sybil system, can evaluate a person's potential for crime and judge how harshly to punish them, anywhere from simply stunning them to making them explode on the spot. This may seem futuristic, but the reason the music isn't simply electronic is due to the fact that these guns are useless unless wielded by inspectors and enforcers, the latter especially being the most human characters in the show. For a bit of context, in the world of psychopaths, enforcers are latent criminals who have been given the chance to work with the police because they have the ability to think like criminals. This does not necessarily mean any of them are bad people. In fact, of the handful that we get to meet in the first season, most of them were, and still are, regular people that just ended up in bad circumstances due to the society they were born into. Because of this, they actually seem much more human from our perspective than the inspectors, who uphold the law as exemplary members of this society, or as the antagonist Makishima Shogo would put it, the true slaves to a society that suppresses free will. That was a bit of a long explanation, but it shows us why, of all the instruments heavily associated with these special police forces, it is the acoustic guitar, the instrument most associated with human connections. No matter what style of music an acoustic guitar is played in, it will always have a certain level of humanity and intimacy that is hard to match on any other instrument, likely because of its versatility, portability, and ability to fit into pretty much any kind of musical setting without seeming out of place. This is also a perfect metaphor for the enforcers who, despite having no real freedom in their everyday lives, are far less restricted when out in the field, as they have nothing but their own morality to uphold in a system that has already turned its back on them. If it wasn't obvious enough, this track is also tied heavily to the enforcers, who ultimately make up most of the show's main group of characters. While I only played a couple of examples that were highly electronic, most of the music in the soundtrack is actually in that style, and tracks like this are far less common. Despite being labeled as criminals, this music allows us to understand that the enforcers aren't really what we might associate with criminals. For the most part, they're just a group of varying personalities that work in a special police force. This jazzy piece captures this well, with the laid-back playing on the acoustic guitar, double bass, and electric piano, immediately lightening any tension surrounding their presence in the precinct. Not only that, this style of jazz also gives off heavy film noir vibes, highly fitting for the jaded view of society most of the enforcers have. Characters like Masaoka Tomomi in particular fit this mold well, being the older, more experienced member that used to be an inspector before his ability to think like his targets turned him into a target himself. He doesn't outright express resentment of the Sybil system, but he understands better than anyone just how flawed it is. And what better kind of music could possibly match characters that all play disillusioned film noir cops than the kind of laid-back jazz you'd hear in any hard-boiled detective flick? Here we've taken a much different turn with a piece for piano and strings. This is one of two acoustic tracks that approaches the show's main theme in an emotional manner, the other being almost the same as this version but as a piano solo instead. One of the most important moments when we hear this track is shortly after Akane's first face-to-face encounter with Makishima, where she fails to shoot him with a regular gun and suffers the consequences of being a slave to the Sybil system. These pieces work in two manners, the first being a more direct reflection of the obvious distress Akane is left in after she watches Makishima kill her best friend right before her eyes, and the second as the first inkling of Akane's humanity awakening. What I mean is that up until this moment, Akane had always trusted in the Sybil system as it was supposed to be flawless, and so she was brutally forced to realize its flaws when it would not deem her target a criminal despite him being a known serial killer. Unlike the enforcers and even her fellow Inspector Ginoza, Akane didn't really have a moment where the music was tied directly to her, as she was basically just a puppet living in a highly flawed society. Because of this, pretty much all of the music associated with her up until this point had much more to do with the overall situation or the characters around her. And by making her first direct music a highly emotional acoustic piece, we can finally begin to experience the changes she will go through. And taking yet another huge leap away from anything else we've heard thus far, this piano piece is oddly uplifting for what we've come to understand as being a dark crime thriller. It isn't as though Psycho-Pass doesn't have any lighter moments, as we already heard some of the lighter music associated with the Enforcers, but this is so light and calming that it almost seems unsettling given the circumstances, which is exactly what it's supposed to be doing. This piano piece is written not just to be light, but specifically as something quite classical to our ears, not unlike a flighty Mozart piece. It should be pretty obvious why this is surprising, given everything else we've heard as well as the aesthetic of the series, but it's this contrast that actually makes this one so much darker, as it is associated with Makishima. As I mentioned before, Makishima is a serial killer that the system doesn't recognize as a criminal due to him being one of the extremely rare cases of someone who is criminally asymptomatic. In his eyes, the system is flawed, stripping people of their free will as every decision in Japan's society is governed by the system. Things like careers are fully decided by the system, while art is highly censored due to its influential nature, and everyone has simply come to accept this as normal, something Makishima and all of the Enforcers view with varying levels of distaste. This is why this lighthearted piano piece is so chilling in context with Makishima, as this lightness is a reflection of his desire to free humanity from the chains of society by way of crimes that force people to use their free will even if it means opposing the system they had trusted their very lives with up until that moment. Here we have the final piece I want to mention, and as you can tell, it's a string version of the piece we just heard, at least for now. This is one of the final pieces of music we hear in the first season, with Kogami finally having caught up with Makishima, gun in hand while the antagonist lies wounded and defenseless on the ground. This lighthearted melody again evokes that sense of unease associated with Makishima, but because of the more cinematic nature of the strings, this feels more climactic and not so unsettling, mostly due to the fact that we can see that he is not going to slip out of this situation. As the piece continues and builds, it shifts from being just a simple string rendition of Paradise into the main theme, though without any of the electronic sounds we had gotten used to hearing it in context with throughout the show. While it would be simple enough to explain this away as the piece sounding more cinematic and conclusive without the electronic beat to back it, I feel that the other reason this piece plays out like this is because by the end of the show, we've come to understand that the major conflict was never between Makishima and Kogami, but between the manner in which they tried to carry out their ideals, as both men actually felt exactly the same about the Sybil system, but obviously had very different ways of standing up to it. In the end, this was a conflict of humanity versus society, though the machine controlling society ultimately turns out to be a human collective, making the more humanistic music all the more suitable to the revelation that the root of all issues was, and continues to be, humans themselves. And that's all I've got for this analysis of Psycho-Pass's soundtrack. I've been wanting to talk about菅野祐悟for a long time now, and while there's definitely a lot to be said about his work on JoJo, I think it would be a disservice for me to speak about anything other than Psycho-Pass, since that's the soundtrack that made me such a fan of his work. There's also a lot of music that I haven't really listened to from Psycho-Pass's soundtrack because for whatever reason the North American released version of the soundtrack is just missing 11 tracks, and I'm sure there's something that I could get out of those. But for the time being, I'll just have to go with my knowledge of the soundtrack as it is. So let me know what you guys think of Psycho-Pass's soundtrack down in the comment section below, and if you enjoyed the analysis, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel. And if you want to be able to vote on my future video topics, make sure to go over and support me on Patreon, where you'll have access to other things as well, like all of the transcriptions I do on more of my deeper analysis videos. Thanks as always for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Viva!